Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the heart of a declining empire, one sultan dared to dream of conquest. He rode out from his palace not as a politician, but as a Ghazi, a holy warrior, seeking the glory of his ancestors. He was Mustafa II, the man who would personally lead his armies into the fire of Europe. But what happens when the dream of glory shatters on the battlefield, leaving an empire humiliated and a sultan broken? This is the story of the last warrior sultan and his catastrophic fall from grace. In the heart of the sprawling Topkapi Palace, a world of silk and shadows, a prince was forged in silence and observation. This was Mustafa, son of Mehmed IV, the Hunter Sultan. His childhood was one of privilege, but privilege tethered to the whims of a faltering empire. In 1687, that tether snapped. His father was deposed, cast down from the pinnacle of power, and Mustafa, along with his brother Ahmed, was ushered into the gilded prison known as the Kafes, the cage. This was no common dungeon. It was an opulent suite of rooms, a place of exquisite comfort and profound psychological torment. For 8.5 years, Mustafa breathed the stagnant air of confinement. Through the intricate latticework of his windows, he could not see the battlefields of Hungary or the Balkans, but he could feel the tremors of defeat. Whispers of lost fortresses, of armies routed by the ascendant Holy League, seeped through the palace walls like a slow poison. He watched from his gilded isolation as two of his uncles, Suleiman II and then Ahmed II, ascended the throne. He saw them rule with trembling hands, unable to halt the hemorrhaging of the empire. Each report of an Austrian victory was a personal indictment of the dynasty's weakness. In this suffocating quiet, a fire was kindled within him. It was a rage born of impotence, a desperate ambition to shatter the cage, not just for himself, but for the empire his ancestors had built. He studied history, poetry, and the art of war, not as a leisurely pursuit, but as a man preparing for a battle he knew must come. The cage was meant to pacify potential rivals, to sand down the sharp edges of ambition. For Mustafa, it did the opposite. It honed his will to a razor's edge, forging a deep, burning conviction that he, and he alone, could reverse the tide of fate. The year is 1695. The death of his uncle, Ahmed II, is not a tragedy for Mustafa, but a release. The doors of the cafes swing open, and a man of 31, bursting with nearly a decade of suppressed energy, walks into the light of absolute power. He inherits not a throne, but a crisis. The Great Turkish War had been raging for 12 years, a relentless drain of men, money, and morale. The treasury was barren, the janissaries were restless, and the magnificent empire of Suleiman was a shadow of its former self, reeling from defeats across its European frontier. Where others saw despair, Mustafa saw his destiny. He refused to be another palace-bound sovereign, another ruler lost in the decadent labyrinth of the harem. Almost immediately, he electrified the court and the capital with a stunning declaration, an imperial edict known as a Hatta Sharif. In it, he proclaimed his sacred intention. He would personally lead the armies of Islam into battle. He declared that comfort, pleasure, and repose were forbidden to him as long as the enemy violated the empire's borders. This was a thunderclap. For generations, the sultans had commanded from the comfort of Istanbul or Edirne. Mustafa was deliberately breaking with this recent past, reaching back into the heroic age of his ancestors. He was invoking the spirit of Selim the Grim and Suleiman the Magnificent. In the eyes of the court, the ulama, and the common soldier, he was not just a new sultan, he was a messianic figure, a Ghazi warrior sent to restore divine favor. He cast off the silks of the palace for the armor of a campaigner. The vow was made. He had promised his people a return to glory, and now the entire Ottoman world watched to see if the prince from the cage could fulfill the prophecy he had written for himself. Making a vow is one thing, making it reality is another entirely. In the summer of 1695, Mustafa II proved his words were not hollow. The Imperial Ottoman army, a vast and lumbering beast, stirred from its long slumber. At its head, mounted on a magnificent warhorse, rode the Sultan himself. The sight was electrifying. For the soldiers, many of whom had only known defeat under distant, faceless commanders, the presence of the Padishah was a potent symbol. He was not just their sovereign, he was their brother in arms, sharing the dust of the road and the uncertainty of battle. This was more than a march. It was a pilgrimage back to the empire's warrior soul. He pushed his army north, into the contested lands of Hungary, a graveyard of Ottoman ambitions for the past decade. His target was the Habsburg forces under the command of Field Marshal Friedrich August. The campaign was a whirlwind of decisive action. Mustafa's presence seemed to sharpen the army's resolve. He moved with a speed and aggression that surprised his Austrian adversaries. He swiftly laid siege to and captured the vital fortress of Lippe. His greatest triumph came when he forced the Habsburg army to abandon its siege of Timisoara, a key Ottoman stronghold. These were not earth-shattering victories in the grand scheme of the war, but their psychological impact was immense. News of the Sultan's successes raced back to Istanbul, igniting celebrations. The chronicles hailed him as Ghazi Mustafa Khan. For a fleeting, glorious moment, the narrative of decline was broken. It seemed the old ways were the best ways, that all the empire needed was a sultan who dared to lead from the front. Mustafa tasted victory, and it was intoxicating. It affirmed his belief in his own destiny and silenced any who doubted his audacious vow. The warrior-sultan had returned, and the future of the empire seemed bright once more. Success is a powerful elixir, but it can also be a dangerous poison. After two successful campaigns in 1695 and 1696, Mustafa II was no longer simply a restorer of fortunes. In his own mind, he was becoming the heir to the greatest of them all, Suleiman the Magnificent. Every decision, every maneuver on the battlefield, was now measured against the towering legacy of his 16th century ancestor. He was no longer just fighting the Habsburgs for territory. He was fighting history itself, chasing the ghost of a golden age. This obsession drove him to launch a third personal campaign in 1697. He was convinced that one more decisive blow would shatter the Holy League and reclaim Hungary for good. But the strategic landscape had changed. His opponent was no longer the cautious Friedrich August. Commanding the Habsburg armies now was a man who would become a legend in his own right, a military genius of the highest order, Prince Eugene of Savoy. Eugene was everything Mustafa's previous opponents were not: daring, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless. He understood the new, faster-paced warfare of Europe, a world of disciplined firepower and rapid maneuver that was quickly leaving the grand, ceremonial style of the Ottomans behind. Yet, Mustafa, buoyed by his past triumphs, saw only another obstacle to his grand destiny. His confidence bordered on hubris. He believed his personal courage and the sheer weight of his army could overwhelm any tactical challenge. As his massive force advanced towards the river Tisa, near the small town of Zenta, he made his plans. He would cross the river, brushing aside any Austrian resistance, and strike deep into Habsburg territory. He underestimated his enemy. He failed to see that the ghost he was chasing, the spectre of Suleiman's glory, was blinding him to the very real and very deadly trap being laid right before his eyes. In the summer of 1695, a wave of cautious optimism swept through the coffeehouses of Istanbul. For the first time in a generation, a sultan rode at the head of his army, not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a true commander. Mustafa II, burning with a desire to erase the shame of Vienna, personally led his forces into Hungary. He was determined to be the Ghazi, the holy warrior that his ancestors were. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed fate might indulge him. His first campaign saw tangible successes. The fortresses of Lippe and Titel, strategic thorns in the Ottoman side, fell to his army. These were not world-altering victories, but they were victories nonetheless. They were symbols. The sight of the Sultan on horseback, sharing the hardships of the campaign with his janissaries, was a potent tonic for an empire sick with defeat. Morale, so long buried under the weight of retreat and concession, began to stir. The following year, in 1696, he marched again. This time, he faced the Habsburg field marshal, Augustus the Strong of Saxony. The armies clashed near the Bega River in the Battle of Ulasch. It was a bloody, indecisive affair, a brutal stalemate where both sides claimed victory before retreating to lick their wounds. But for Mustafa, a stalemate against a major European commander was spun as a triumph. Back in Edirne, his preferred capital, the court poets sang his praises. He was the new Suleiman, the restorer of Ottoman glory. But this was a dangerous illusion. These minor gains and hard-fought draws were tactical maneuvers, not strategic shifts. They were the equivalent of winning a few hands while losing the entire game. The Holy League was a wounded beast, not a slain one. Mustafa's personal bravery was undeniable, but it was blinding him to the larger, grim reality. He mistook the flickering of a candle for a new dawn, believing his will alone could reverse the tide of history. His confidence swelled, becoming a dangerous arrogance. He had proven to himself and his people that an Ottoman army led by its sultan was invincible. It was a belief that would lead him and his empire directly into the abyss. While Mustafa II celebrated his perceived triumphs, the gears of power in Vienna were turning with cold, ruthless efficiency. The Habsburg Emperor, Leopold I, was a patient, calculating monarch. He understood that the war in Hungary was not a series of disconnected skirmishes, but a generational struggle for the soul of Europe. The indecisive battles and minor Ottoman gains were an annoyance, but they served to focus the imperial mind. A change was needed. The man chosen to enact this change would become the Ottoman Empire's nemesis. He was a French prince who had been scorned by his own king, Louis XIV. His name was Eugene of Savoy. Diminutive in stature, but a giant in military intellect, Eugene was the antithesis of Mustafa. Where the Sultan was driven by passion, romantic ideals of holy war, and a desperate need for personal glory, Eugene was a creature of pure logic and strategy. He saw war not as a stage for heroism, but as a complex mathematical problem to be solved through logistics, discipline, and the exploitation of enemy weakness. In 1697, he was given supreme command of the imperial forces in Hungary. He found an army in disarray, unpaid, demoralized, and poorly equipped. With breathtaking speed and efficiency, he reformed it, secured its funding, and instilled a new, iron discipline. While Eugene forged his weapon, other fronts were closing in on the Ottomans. To the northeast, the nascent Russian Empire, under the restless and ambitious Tsar Peter the Great, had captured the crucial fortress of Azov. This opened the Black Sea to Russian ships for the first time, creating a second front that drained Ottoman resources and attention. The empire was being squeezed. The Holy League was re-energized, not as a disparate collection of allies, but as a unified force with a singular purpose. A crusade, in all but name, was being waged against the Crescent, and at its tip was the sharp, analytical mind of Prince Eugene. He was not interested in stalemates or minor border adjustments. He was hunting for a single decisive blow that would shatter Ottoman power in Europe for good. In the summer of 1697, convinced of his destiny, Mustafa II embarked on his third and most ambitious campaign. This would be the one to break the Habsburgs, to reclaim the lost lands and secure his legacy. An enormous army, perhaps over 100,000 strong, assembled at Edirne. It was a river of men and steel flowing north, with the Sultan himself as its heart. At his side was the new Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, a capable administrator, but a man whose military advice was often coloured by a desire to please his sovereign. The Sultan's objective was grandiose, the siege of Petrovaradin, a key fortress on the Danube. But from the beginning, the campaign was plagued by indecision. The Ottoman command debated strategy, wasting precious weeks while their supply lines stretched ever thinner. Prince Eugene, meanwhile, played a lethal game of cat and mouse. His army was smaller, but it was agile, disciplined, and perfectly informed. His spies shadowed the Ottoman host, reporting every move, every argument, every hesitation. Eugene knew he could not risk a direct pitched battle against a numerically superior foe. He had to wait for a mistake. He had to wait for Mustafa to give him an opening. And Mustafa, blinded by his past successes and impatient for a glorious victory, obliged him. After abandoning the difficult siege of Petrovaradin, the Sultan decided to march into Upper Hungary to attack Szeged. To get there, his massive army needed to cross the Tisza River. Against the strenuous objections of some of his more experienced commanders, who warned of the danger, Mustafa and his Grand Vizier chose a crossing point near the small town of Zenta. They ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge, a fragile lifeline across the wide, muddy river. As the Ottoman cavalry and artillery began to cross, followed by the Sultan and his personal retinue, the bulk of the army, the infantry, the elite janissaries, the heart of their power, remained on the southern bank, waiting their turn. They were trapped, exposed, their backs to the water. Eugene, receiving the news from his scouts, knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The Sultan had not just made a mistake, he had delivered his army into a perfect trap. On September 11th, 1697, as the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, hell erupted on the banks of the Tisza River. Prince Eugene's army, having completed a series of brilliant forced marches, burst from the woods. They formed a perfect crescent, mirroring the Ottoman standard, trapping the main body of Mustafa's infantry against the riverbank. There was no room to maneuver, no space to form proper battle lines. There was only shock, and then absolute panic. The Imperial artillery opened up at point-blank range, tearing horrific gaps in the densely packed ranks of the janissaries. Then the cavalry charged. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Ottoman soldiers, caught completely by surprise, broke almost immediately. Disciplined regiments dissolved into a screaming mob, desperate to escape the Habsburg steel. Their only route of escape was the pontoon bridge, the very lifeline that had become their death trap. Thousands surged onto the narrow structure, which groaned under the weight and then collapsed, plunging men, horses and wagons into the swirling currents of the Tisza. From the far bank, Sultan Mustafa II watched in impotent horror as his magnificent army was annihilated. He could see his standards fall, hear the death cries of his elite soldiers, and watch as thousands of his best men drowned in the muddy water. The Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, fighting bravely amidst the chaos, was killed by his own mutinous troops. The imperial seal, the very symbol of Ottoman authority, was lost in the mud. 10,000 Ottomans drowned. 20,000 more were cut down on the riverbank. It was one of the most lopsided and catastrophic defeats in the empire's history. As night fell, a stunned Mustafa fled the scene, abandoning his camp, his treasury, and the last vestiges of his warrior dream. The road to Zenta had been paved with pride. The return journey was a path of pure humiliation. The warrior-sultan was broken. The man who rode north to emulate Suleiman the Magnificent limped south, the ghost of a king leading the ghost of an army. The dream was dead, drowned in the muddy waters of the Tisza River. As the remnants of the Ottoman army staggered back from the catastrophe at Zenta, Sultan Mustafa II was a man hollowed out by shock and fury. The campaign that was to be his masterpiece, his restoration of Ottoman glory, had ended in the most lopsided defeat imaginable. The imperial seal, the Grand Vizier's tent, 100 cannons, and the lives of 20,000 of his best soldiers were now in enemy hands. In the heart of a king, such a colossal failure cannot be borne alone. It demands a sacrifice, a scapegoat to carry the weight of shame. That burden was to fall upon Elmas Mehmed Pasha, the Grand Vizier. He was a capable administrator, but on that fateful day, he had counseled the Sultan to cross the river, a tactical blunder of epic proportions. Now, in the chaotic aftermath, as the Sultan's party fled the pursuing Austrians, Mustafa's grief curdled into a cold, vengeful rage. The accounts are stark and brutal. There was no trial, no formal inquiry. There was only the Sultan's will, forged in the fires of humiliation. On the retreat, surrounded by the terrified survivors, Mustafa ordered the execution of his own commander. The Janissaries, already mutinous and blaming the vizier for the loss of their comrades and their pay chest, needed little encouragement. They fell upon Elmas Mehmed Pasha, strangling him in the chaos of the camp. His death was a grim necessity for the Sultan's psyche. It was not justice, it was a desperate act of transference. By killing his vizier, Mustafa could momentarily convince himself that the fault lay not with the Sultan who led his army to ruin, but with the advisor who gave the final fatal counsel. The sacrifice was made, but the stain of Zenta could not be washed away with a single man's blood. Defeat on the battlefield is a wound to a nation's body, but the treaty that follows is a scar upon its soul. For the Ottoman Empire, that scar would be carved at Karlowitz in the winter of 1699. For the first time in its history, the Sublime Porte was not dictating terms, but receiving them. The negotiations were a masterclass in humiliation, orchestrated by the victorious Holy League. The Ottomans, so accustomed to the posture of conquerors, were forced to sit as equals, and in reality, as inferiors, to the Christian powers. The venue itself was symbolic, a specially constructed conference hall with 4 separate doors, so that no delegation would be seen to enter before another, a meticulous protocol designed to strip the Ottomans of any pretense of superiority. The chief Ottoman negotiator, Rami Mehmed Pasha, fought valiantly with words where swords had failed, but the reality was undeniable. The empire was broken, its treasury empty, its armies shattered. The terms of the treaty were devastating. An entire kingdom, Hungary, along with Transylvania, was formally ceded to the Habsburgs, ending nearly 2 centuries of Ottoman presence. Poland regained Podolia, and Venice expanded its holdings in Dalmatia. This was not a minor border adjustment, it was a continental amputation. For Sultan Mustafa II, the man who had ridden out with the sword of Osman to reclaim these very lands, the news was a final, crushing blow. His personal quest for glory, his attempt to emulate his warrior ancestors, had culminated in the single greatest territorial loss in the empire's history. The Treaty of Karlowitz marked the end of an era. The tide of Ottoman expansion in Europe had not just stopped, it had been decisively and permanently reversed. The empire was now on the defensive, a psychological shift from which it would never truly recover. The warrior-sultan had become the sultan of retreat. How does a man who dreams of being Alexander the Great cope with becoming a cautionary tale? For Mustafa II, the answer was to disappear. The crushing humiliation of Karlowitz shattered more than his military ambitions. It broke his spirit. The warrior persona he had so carefully constructed was now a source of profound shame. He could no longer bear to be the political and military heart of the empire in Istanbul, a city that had witnessed his grand departures for war and now whispered about his catastrophic return. And so, he retreated. He abandoned the sprawling, politically charged Topkapi Palace for the relative quiet of Edirne, the empire's former capital. Officially, the move was for the hunting, and indeed, Mustafa threw himself into the chase with a desperate fervour. Day after day, he would ride out into the forests of Thrace, hunting wild game, perhaps trying to recapture a sense of the martial prowess that had failed him on the battlefield. But this was more than a hobby. It was an abdication. He became an absentee monarch, consumed by hunts, poetry competitions, and the secluded pleasures of his Edirne palace. While the Sultan was away, the heart of the empire in Istanbul began to atrophy. The grand viziers and ministers found themselves governing without a sovereign, their authority diminished. The janissaries and the citizens of the capital felt abandoned, their ruler having seemingly turned his back on them in favour of provincial leisure. This was not the dignified retirement of a victorious emperor, but the self-imposed exile of a defeated one. By withdrawing from the center of power, Mustafa created a vacuum. He was still the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, but his throne in Topkapi sat empty. And in the world of Ottoman politics, a vacuum never remains unfilled for long. It was an invitation for others to seize the power that he no longer wished to wield. Into the power vacuum left by a broken and absent sultan stepped a man of God, Sheikh-ul-Islam, Feyzullah Effendi. He was more than just the highest religious authority in the empire. He had been Mustafa's childhood tutor. He was the man who had filled the young prince's head with tales of glorious ancestors and dreams of conquest. In the sultan's mind, Feyzullah was not just an advisor, but a figure of immense personal trust and intellectual authority, a link to the hopeful boy he once was. As Mustafa retreated into his private world of hunting and poetry in Edirne, he delegated more and more of the state's affairs to his old mentor. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of psychological dependency. Mustafa, unable to face the complexities of a state reeling from defeat, handed the reins to the one man he believed was beyond reproach. Feyzullah Effendi, however, was not immune to the temptations of absolute power. He quickly transformed his religious office into the de facto center of government. His word became law. He controlled appointments, dismissed viziers, and directed policy, all under the authority of a sultan who rarely questioned him. This authority soon curdled into rampant nepotism. Key positions throughout the empire were filled by his sons, sons-in-law, and relatives, a clique that became known derisively as the Feyzullah Zades. The state, which was supposed to be a meritocracy, was becoming a family enterprise. The people of Istanbul watched with growing fury as their sultan remained in Edirne, while a cleric and his clan enriched themselves, mismanaged the economy, and sold offices to the highest bidder. The warrior-sultan, the Ghazi who had promised to restore the empire's might, was now a recluse, a puppet master's pawn. The empire was not being ruled from the throne, but from the Sheikh-ul-Islam's mansion, a situation that was not only corrupt, but deeply unnatural, and one that could only end in fire and blood. In the years following the humiliation of Karlowitz, a profound and dangerous silence fell upon the heart of the empire. The Topkapi Palace, once the vibrant center of global power, now felt like a hollowed-out monument. Its courtyards, where ambassadors once trembled and viziers plotted, were unnervingly quiet. The Sultan was gone. Mustafa II, the warrior who had promised a return to the glory of Suleiman, had retreated to his preferred palace in Edirne, leaving Constantinople to fester in its own discontent. The city, the true capital, felt abandoned, its people orphaned by their own sovereign. In the shadowed halls of the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque, the ulama, the clerical elite, spoke in hushed, angry tones. They saw the Sultan's Grand Mufti, Sheikh-ul-Islam Feyzullah Effendi, not as a spiritual guide, but as a tyrant in a turban. Feyzullah's power was absolute in the Sultan's absence. He had installed his sons, his nephews, his sycophants into every lucrative position, bleeding the state's coffers and perverting the sacred laws for personal gain. His arrogance was a daily insult to the proud traditions of the empire. In the coffeehouses and bazaars, the whispers were less cautious. Merchants, ruined by new taxes levied to fund the Sultan's distant lifestyle, cursed Feyzullah's name. Artisans, whose guilds were ignored, spoke of a court detached from reality. And in the barracks of the Janissaries, the whispers were sharpest of all. These were men who had shed their blood for the Sultan on the fields of Zenta, only to see him trade his sword for a hunting falcon. They saw their pay delayed, their honor ignored, while a corrupt cleric and an absentee monarch indulged themselves. The empire was not being governed, it was being plundered. The whispers in Topkapi were not of a coup, not yet. They were the sound of a foundation cracking under unbearable pressure, the slow, grinding noise of an empire beginning to turn on itself. Edirne was a city of pleasure, a verdant paradise nestled in Thrace. For Mustafa II, it was a sanctuary from the failures and compromises that defined his reign. Here, the stinging memory of Karlowitz could be drowned in lavish hunts and extravagant feasts. He surrounded himself with poets and musicians, not generals and statesmen. The affairs of state were a distant rumour, an unpleasantry managed by his trusted Grand Mufti, Feyzullah Effendi. This extended sojourn, which stretched from months into years, became known as the Edirne affair, and it was a political wound that would not stop bleeding. To the populace of Constantinople, it was more than just neglect. It was a profound act of betrayal. Their city, the seat of the caliphate, the jewel of the world, had been demoted to a provincial town. The Sultan's absence created a vacuum, and Feyzullah Effendi filled it with a rapacious nepotism that defied all precedent. The final, unforgivable transgression came when he arranged for his own son to be appointed Sheikh-ul-Islam, a position he himself held. It was a move to create a hereditary religious dynasty, an act so audacious it was seen as blasphemy against the established order. While the court in Edirne chased deer through the forests, Constantinople choked on injustice. The price of bread soared. The Janissary garrisons, their pay in arrears, grew restless and insubordinate. Delegations sent to Edirne to petition the Sultan were turned away, their pleas dismissed by the very officials whose corruption was the source of their misery. The Edirne affair demonstrated a fatal disconnect between the ruler and the ruled. Mustafa believed he was merely enjoying the traditional pastimes of a sultan. His people believed he had abdicated his sacred duty, abandoning the throne of Osman for a hunter's lodge. He had forgotten the cardinal rule of Ottoman power. The Sultan must not only rule, he must be seen to rule from the heart of his empire. The spark that ignited the inferno was, as is so often the case, a matter of money. A corps of Janissaries, the Sebesis, who were responsible for arms and ordnance, returned to Constantinople from a grueling campaign in Georgia. They were weary, battle-scarred, and expecting their long overdue pay. Instead, they were told the treasury was empty and their payment would be deferred indefinitely. To make matters worse, the official who delivered the news was a proxy for the hated Feyzullah Effendi. It was the final insult. On a hot July day in 1703, their simmering resentment boiled over into open revolt. The Sebesis marched to the Et Meidana, the meat square, the traditional gathering place for Janissary protest. There, they committed the ultimate act of defiance. They overturned their great bronze cauldrons. For a Janissary, the cauldron was a sacred symbol of his core. To overturn it was to declare that they would no longer accept the Sultan's soup, his sustenance, and his authority. The rebellion had begun. What started with a few hundred disgruntled soldiers quickly swelled into a deluge. Other Janissary autors, hearing the news, joined the uprising. They were soon followed by the ulama, who saw a chance to depose their arch-nemesis, Feyzullah Effendi. Merchants, artisans, and common citizens, emboldened by the military's protection, poured into the streets, their personal grievances merging into a single deafening roar of collective fury. The rebels were not a mindless mob. They acted with chilling speed and organization. They established a provisional government, choosing their own leaders and issuing formal demands. Their primary targets were clear: the immediate dismissal and execution of Sheikh-ul-Islam Feyzullah Effendi and the return of the Sultan to Constantinople. They did not yet call for Mustafa's abdication. They were, in theory, loyal subjects demanding the removal of a corrupt advisor. But everyone knew this was a fiction. The Sultan's authority was being challenged directly, and the Janissaries' fury, once unleashed, would not be easily contained. The rebellion was no longer a riot confined to the capital. It had become an army on the move. A vast, formidable column of humanity began the 150-mile march from Constantinople to Edirne. This was not merely a military procession. At its core were the elite Janissary regiments, marching with grim purpose, their banners held high. But they were joined by thousands of others, a true cross-section of a society at its breaking point. Grey-bearded imams marched alongside fiery young students. Wealthy merchants, who had funded the rebellion, rode on horseback next to penniless artisans, carrying makeshift weapons. It was a river of discontent, flowing inexorably towards the Sultan. In Edirne, panic began to set in. Mustafa II, shaken from his leisurely existence, was paralyzed by indecision. His initial response was disbelief, followed by a series of desperate, clumsy maneuvers. He sent envoys to negotiate, offering to dismiss Feyzullah Effendi, but the offer was rejected as too little, too late. The rebels now tasted real power, and their demands had escalated. They would not be placated by the sacrifice of a single vizier. He dispatched a small force of loyal troops to intercept the rebels, but they melted away, either deserting to the other side or refusing to fight their brothers in arms. The Sultan's authority was evaporating with every mile the rebels advanced. The march itself became a powerful political statement. As the column passed through towns and villages, they were greeted not as traitors, but as liberators. Locals offered them food and water, cheering them on. The Sultan, isolated in his pleasure palace, was now the rebel. The army marching on him represented the legitimate will of the people. As the vanguard of the rebel army was spotted on the hills overlooking Edirne, a final chilling realization dawned upon Mustafa II. There was nowhere left to run. The army he had neglected, the capital he had abandoned, and the people he had ignored were now at his gates, and they had come to deliver their judgment. As the rebel army, a furious coalition of janissaries, artisans, and disgruntled clerics, swelled outside the walls of Edirne, Sultan Mustafa II found himself trapped, not by enemy cannons or foreign legions, but by the consequences of his own neglect. His beloved hunting grounds had become the cage for his crumbling authority. In a desperate gambit, he dispatched the one man he believed could reason with the mob, his younger brother, Shehzadeh Ahmed. It was a fateful decision, steeped in the tragic irony that defines Ottoman dynastic politics. Ahmed, who had spent his life in the gilded confines of the palace, was sent to placate the very men who were demanding his brother's head. The rebels, however, saw not an emissary, but an alternative. They had no interest in negotiating with a sultan they deemed decadent and detached. They wanted a new ruler, one who would reside in Istanbul and heed their will. They offered Ahmed the throne. Here, history holds its breath. We can only imagine the turmoil in Ahmed's mind. To accept was to betray his own blood, the man who was not only his sultan, but his brother. To refuse was to risk his own life and plunge the empire deeper into a civil war it could not afford. The weight of 3 centuries of fratricide, of ambition and survival, pressed down on him. Mustafa, waiting anxiously in his palace, had staked his reign on familial loyalty. He believed that the bond of brotherhood would hold firm against the tide of rebellion. But the Ottoman throne was a force more powerful than blood. It was a vortex of power that warped loyalties and shattered families. Ahmed, faced with an offer of absolute power and the very real threat of annihilation, made his choice. He sided with the rebellion. The message sent back to Mustafa was not one of reconciliation, but of usurpation. The final, most intimate betrayal had been delivered, not by a rival vizier or a foreign king, but by the brother he had trusted to save him. The end came not with the clash of steel, but with the chilling finality of a legal document. On August 22, 1703, the senior Islamic jurists, bowing to the immense pressure of the rebel army encamped around the palace, issued the fatwa. The religious edict declared Mustafa II unfit to rule. It cited his abandonment of Istanbul, his indulgence in trivial pursuits while the state suffered, and his deference to the corrupt counsel of his former tutor, Sheikh-ul-Islam Feyzullah Effendi. It was the sacred justification for a political execution. The ceremony of deposition was a masterpiece of calculated humiliation. Mustafa, the man who had styled himself a Ghazi, a holy warrior leading his armies into battle, was brought before the leaders of the coup. He was no longer the shadow of God on earth. He was simply a man who had failed. There was no grand throne room, no opulent display. This was a raw, brutal transfer of power. They stripped him of his imperial turban, the symbol of his authority, and the jeweled dagger from his belt. Each removed item was a dismantling of his identity. We see not a monarch, but a man being systematically erased. His brother Ahmed, now declared Sultan Ahmed III, was brought forth. The two brothers stood face to face in a moment of profound, unbearable tension. One ascending to the pinnacle of power, the other descending into the abyss of imprisonment. The oaths of allegiance, the biat, were sworn not to Mustafa, but to Ahmed. The court officials, the military commanders, the very men who had once bowed to Mustafa, now turned their backs on him and pledged their lives to his successor. For Mustafa, this was a death more profound than any battlefield loss. At Zenta, he had lost an army. In Edirne, he lost himself. He was led away, not in chains, but in the invisible shackles of shame and powerlessness, destined for the one place all deposed sultans feared, the Kafes, the cage, within the walls of Topkapi Palace. Imprisonment in the Topkapi Palace was a special kind of hell for a man like Mustafa II. The Kafes, the cage, was not a dungeon of stone and iron, but a suite of opulent rooms where princes were held in gilded isolation. Yet for a man who had tasted absolute power, who had galloped at the head of his armies with the wind of the Hungarian plains in his face, these beautiful walls were a tomb. He was a prisoner of his own legacy, confined to the very palace he had abandoned for the freedom of Edirne. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. The warrior-sultan was now a ghost, haunting the halls of his ancestors. He was given every comfort, but denied the one thing he craved: purpose. His days, once filled with the governance of an empire and the thrill of the hunt, were now an endless stretch of silence and reflection. He had ample time to contemplate his catastrophic defeat at Zenta, the loss of Hungary, and the final, humiliating betrayal by his own subjects and brother. Chroniclers of the time speak of a rapid decline. The man who was once robust enough for grueling military campaigns became frail and gaunt. He refused food, lost interest in conversation, and succumbed to a deep, unshakable melancholy. The official cause of his death, on December 29, 1703, just 4 months after his deposition, was recorded as edema or dropsy. But few in the empire believed it was a purely physical ailment. The consensus, whispered in the markets and corridors of power, was that Mustafa II died of a broken heart. He died of gam, the profound Turkish word for a grief so deep it consumes the soul. He was a man whose ambition had soared to the heights of his most legendary ancestors, only to be dashed against the rocks of reality. His body had simply given up, unable to contain the crushing weight of his failure. The failed warrior's final campaign was an internal one, a battle against despair which he could not win. How does history judge a man whose ambitions so vastly outstripped his abilities? Mustafa II's legacy is one of profound and tragic contradiction. He ascended the throne with a singular burning desire to reverse a century of Ottoman decline and reclaim the warrior mantle of Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the last Ottoman Sultan to personally lead his armies into battle on a grand scale, a final defiant roar of the old imperial tradition. Yet, this very ambition led him to the fields of Zenta, the site of one of the most catastrophic defeats in the empire's history. His failure there led directly to the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a document that forever altered the balance of power in Europe. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire negotiated as a defeated power, ceding vast territories and acknowledging the supremacy of its Christian rivals. This was his most visible legacy, the beginning of the end of Ottoman expansion. But his more subtle and perhaps more significant legacy was forged in his downfall. The Edirne incident of 1703 was not just a rebellion, it was a revolution in the Ottoman power structure. By deposing a sultan for his policies and personal conduct, the coalition of janissaries, ulama, and Istanbul notables established a powerful precedent. Never again would a sultan command the unquestioned, absolute authority of his predecessors. Power became a negotiated commodity, contested between the palace, the military, and the bureaucracy. Mustafa, in his failure, inadvertently became the catalyst for a new political era. Ironically, while his reign ended in disgrace, it sowed the seeds for the cultural flourishing that would define his brother's rule. The peace he was forced to sign and the political shift he was forced to endure created the conditions for the Tulip era, a period of unprecedented artistic and architectural brilliance. He is remembered not as the conqueror he dreamt of being, but as the failed warrior whose reign marked the painful yet definitive transition of the Ottoman Empire from a world-conquering force to a power fighting for its own survival.